I love using the waste yarn cast on and cast off method, but now let's make it even better by using a ravel cord so it's super easy to remove your waste yarn. To do this, it's just one more step from the waste yarn method. So if you'd like a full in-depth tutorial on how to cast on or what the waste yarn method is, check out the description in the video below, and I have links to both of those tutorials there for you. So we're going to cast on with our waste yarn. This is a like-weighted yarn, but is not a part of the project yarn, and you want it to be in a contrasting color to your project yarn. And I like to do between 5 and 6 rows for the cast on. Once your rows of your waste yarn or your scrap yarn is done, then we're going to take another color. This is the Ravel Cord, and I'm going to use purple. And we're going to add it to the machine just like you would when you're adding a new color or a second skein of yarn. So I've put my waste yarn in the middle of my machine, and then at my white needle, that's where I like to start my next rows. I hook it around the white needle and put it into my yarn holder and yarn tensioner. You don't want to skip a needle, because if you did, then you would get a drop stitch where you skip the needle. So make sure it's the next needle where you add on your ravel cord. And now we're going to crank around one time. So we just do one row with our ravel cord, which is nice to do a different color from your waste yarn to your project yarn. So it's easy to identify which one's your ravel cord. Now I stop that at my 47th needle because I just do one row. And now we're going to add on our project yarn. And again, since I stopped at my 47th needle, I just want to make sure all the yarn is down and hooked in there. And now I add on my project yarn to my white needle, my 48th needle, and then you're going to crank out your rows like normal. Again, make sure you don't skip a needle. If you stop at your 47th needle, your next needle, which is my white one, the 48th, is where you want to add on your project yarn. You want to make it like a continuous piece of yarn. You don't want to skip any needles. And now you will crank out as many rows as you need for your project. So I'm going to speed up the video while I crank out my project yarn rows. While I'm cranking these rows out, I just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about the ravel cord. This is a knitting method knitters use, and it's recommended for your ravel cord is you want to use a strong fiber yarn. In this video, I used an acrylic yarn, and I'm going to show you what can happen and how to fix it when you use the acrylic yarn, because it can break. It's recommended to use a silk or a cotton yarn as your ravel cord, as that fiber is stronger. But if you only have acrylic like I do, acrylic will work just fine. But it is also recommended that it's in a similar weight to your project yarn. And we will talk about 2 different options with this when we go to remove the waste yarn, so you can see the difference when using acrylic yarn. Okay, all of my project yarn has now been cranked out. I've done as many rows as I want. So now we're going to put the rest of my project yarn into the middle of my machine, any of the leftovers. And again, I stopped at my 47th needle. That's what my project yarn is hooked onto. Now we're going to do another ravel cord, and I started at my white needle, the next needle over from where my project yarn stopped. And again, I'm going to use the purple yarn, and then we're going to crank one row around with the purple yarn as our ravel cord. Once we have one row, we're going to take the tail end of our ravel cord, any extra, and we are going to put it in the machine. And I stopped at my 47th needle. That's what the ravel cord is still hooked onto. And the tail is in the middle of the machine. Now let's do our cast off with our waste yarn. I'm going to get the yellow yarn again, and I'm going to add it to my 48th white needle. Put the tail end down into the machine, and now we're going to crank out, I like between 8 and 10 rows. As the waste yarn cast off, we are not going to lock any of the stitches, so they can drop a few. So that's why I like to add a few more rows of my cast off waste yarn, just in case any stitches drop, they won't drop all the way down to my project yarn. Once you have your rows of your waste yarn done, you can either cut the end of your tail yarn, or you can just let it run out. And then once the tail runs out through the machine, there's no more yarn being cranked on there. Crank one time around, and then when you crank the second time around, your project will come off the machine. Now you can close the end of your tubes with a slip stitch. If you would like a more in-depth tutorial on how to do this, again, click my waste yarn cast on and cast off video that is linked in the description below. Now the fun part. Once your stitches are all secured and you have your tube closed, we can remove the waste yarn using our Ravel cord. I'm going to show you this project first. This was a Ravel cord that I used, and it is an acrylic yarn, but I used a number 3 weighted yarn or a DK yarn as my Ravel cord, and then all my other yarn was a number 4 or a worsted yarn. And so when I pull that Ravel cord out, this yarn did not break, and I think because it was slightly smaller than my project yarn, and so it came out easier even though it was an acrylic yarn. For this one that I did, I used the same weight yarn. All the yarn on this project is a number 4 or a worsted weight yarn. The other thing is that this was the number 4 worsted big twist value brand yarn, and as you pull it, you might cinch up your project a little bit, and that's fine because we're trying to remove that Ravel cord. But you see, when it got kind of tight, my Ravel cord broke. So then I went to the other side of the Ravel cord, pulled on it, and it broke as well. If that happens to you, that's fine. All you need to do is unscrunch your project and find where the Ravel cord has been removed, where it broke, and those stitches will fall off. And this is why it's really good to use a different color for your Ravel cord compared to your waste yarn and your project yarn. So it's really easy to identify what's my Ravel cord. I found my little tail end that's still in there that broke, and then we're just going to remove the rest of the Ravel cord. So I took a stitch marker, and since it got cinched up pretty tight, I just kind of pick out one of the stitches that's purple because I know it's my Ravel cord, and then I was able to remove the rest of it, and then your project yarn and your waste yarn comes apart and you're left with a really nice finished project. So now we're going to go to the other side of our tube, and we're going to do the same thing. We want to remove the Ravel cord. So when we pull on the tail, first the stitches are going to disappear. Just doing that by itself, all the stitches are hooked together. You need to completely remove your Ravel cord. And the same thing happened on this side. As I continue pulling and it kind of scrunches up the project, the Ravel cord broke, and I think it's because it's an acrylic yarn. But then I pulled the other tail in and I was able to remove it all, and now we're left with a really nice finished completed project. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and I appreciate so much all the likes, follows, and the comments. Happy crafting, everybody.